Okay, in today's lecture, I'll be reviewing fallacies. The ability to identify fallacies is very helpful. Plus, you can look for fallacies in the text you choose to evaluate for your paper this week, too. Knowing your fallacies can give you content for evaluation. I hope you watched the 3 assigned videos on fallacies. Fallacies are often quite unfamiliar to students, and it takes some time practicing to identify them. Fallacies are often unfamiliar to students, so it would be worthwhile to get a couple types of exposure to them. This is the full list of fallacies covered by the Mike Rignetta in those 3 videos. You can find a complete list with definitions on our Moodle page in a handout. None of the definitions in this presentation are my own, but were cobbled together from the University of North Carolina's Writing Center website and logicallyfallacious.com. So let's start with the straw man fallacy, which refers to an overly simplistic and completely false version of your opponent's position to make it easier to knock over. Accusing your opponent of advocating baby eating is a pretty good example of the straw man fallacy. Ad hominem fallacies focus on the moral character of the opponent rather than on their actual arguments. It's a means of distracting the audience. This is especially true if the moral judgments have no bearing on the argument itself. A false dichotomy falsely narrows down the possible argumentative positions into only 2 alternatives, one of which is not appealing, leaving only one single option. When someone says you're either with us or against us, that's an example of the black and white fallacy or false dichotomy. The authority fallacy uses famous names to impress the audience and convince the audience that they are an expert worth listening to, when their credentials might have nothing to do with the topic at hand. When you examine ethos, keep the authority fallacy in mind. The no true Scotsman fallacy tries to exclude a position with an appeal to purity. The classic example of the no true Scotsman looks like this. Person A: no Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. Person B: but my Uncle Angus is a Scotsman and he puts sugar on his porridge. Person A: but no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. The fallacy is committed when you focus on whether or not your opponent committed a fallacy. Just because an argument contains a fallacy does not mean the argument itself is wrong. It just means the fallacy is wrong. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy ignores inconvenience evidence. So if you join a dating site and get matched with a creepy guy based on your common love of pizza and movies, while ignoring your differences in age, values, religion, and desire for children, someone has committed a Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Moving the goalposts is a kind of fallacy in which the opponent requires increasingly more difficult to satisfy counterarguments. So if your boss says you need a PhD for the job and you say you have one, and then they say you need an Olympic gold medal and you say you have one, and then they say you need a posthumous Medal of Honor, that's an example of moving the goalposts. An appeal to emotion is when an arguer attempts to manipulate the argument through emotional appeals rather than through logic and reason. The line between legitimate pathos and this fallacy is difficult to define, but my sense is that you should use pathos to back up well-reasoned arguments, but don't rely on the emotional appeals alone. Non sequiturs are logical fallacies in which the conclusion doesn't actually follow from the premises offered. There are lots of versions of this kind of fallacy, but a good catch-all term to refer to arguments that have a breakdown in logic. Just because some pit bulls are aggressive doesn't mean your life is in danger because you have a pit bull neighbor. The last fallacy covered in the videos by Mike Rignetta is the appeal to nature, and it occurs when the arguer implies that something is good because it is natural. There are lots of elements in nature that are actually poisonous and dangerous. Nature isn't inherently good or inherently bad. So I wanted to increase your fallacy toolbox by adding a few more useful fallacies that I know and ones that I think are pretty common. In fact, I chose this list because they are so incredibly common. So let's start with bandwagon. Bandwagon fallacy is some form of the argument that something must be good because everyone's doing it. Popular things are not always good. Tu quoque is a fancy way of calling out hypocrisy. You can't rule out an argument just because the person saying it is a hypocrite. They may actually be correct. So imagine if someone smokes, makes an argument against smoking, and somebody decides, well, you're a hypocrite, so you must be wrong. Well, no, because their argument is against smoking, which is unhealthy, right? So just because they're a hypocrite doesn't mean they're wrong. Red herring is another kind of fallacy of distraction, in which an opponent brings up a tangential line of reasoning that doesn't necessarily bear on the current argument, like a mother who distracts her child from the toy aisle by promising treats at home. Cherry picking occurs when an opponent ignores the bulk of the evidence for one piece of evidence that proves their point. Cherry picking is common when there is no conclusive evidence. Scapegoating is a fallacy in which you shift the blame to an unpopular person or group who then becomes the scapegoat for the problem. The appeal to tradition argues that just because someone is old, it is better. When someone says, but we've always done it that way, they're committing the fallacy of the appeal to tradition. On the flip side, you can also commit a fallacy when you say something new is automatically better. That's not the case either. Finally, slippery slope fallacies. These are committed when you over-exaggerate the possible consequence of a series of events. It's a kind of fear-mongering in an attempt to scare the audience to take out of taking certain actions. So, for example, contrary to popular belief, if you skip your homework one time, you won't actually fail out of college. If you can respond to any situation by saying, well, that escalated quickly, there's a good chance you've encountered a slippery slope. Okay, let's play a game. Let's play Spot the Fallacy. Here's the first. Spot the fallacy. Why worry about panda extinction when there are homeless people? That's a red herring because it distracts you from the main argument through an unrelated tangential point. Okay, spot the next fallacy. Old he is, wise he must be. Now that's an authority fallacy. Just because somebody is old, it doesn't mean that they have the credential of a wisdom. Although Yoda, he may. Spot the fallacy. I like to be natural, so I don't brush my teeth. That's right. It's an appeal to nature. Natural isn't always good. Spot the fallacy. Unicorns are awesome. I am awesome. Therefore, I am a unicorn. Okay, so this is a non sequitur because the logic is incorrect. If you can't remember fancy words like non sequitur or tu quoque or whatever, you can just label it a fallacy of logic and you're doing great. All right, spot this fallacy. If I share my pizza, I might as well just move to a communist country. Can you add, well, that escalated quickly? Yes? Then it must be a slippery slope fallacy. Okay, the first man here says, we should improve society somewhat. The second man says, yet you participate in society. The second man is committing a fallacy. What is it? Okay, that's tu quoque, which is the accusation that hypocrisy invalidates the argument. A hypocrite can still be right. Spot this fallacy. Coronavirus is all plankton's fault. Yep, that's scapegoating because an unpopular target being unfairly and incorrectly blamed for a problem is called scapegoating. Okay, spot this fallacy. Eat everything on your plate. Think of the starving kids in Africa. Oh, this is a couple. It's a red herring fallacy because it tries to distract you with an unrelated point. But it's also an appeal to emotion because it tries to manipulate the argument through emotional appeals. Okay, here's one. Spot the fallacy. Why don't you wear a party hat? Everyone else is wearing one. Okay, that's bandwagon because popular actions are not always good. Spot the fallacy. Person 1 says, homeopathy works. Show me a study proving otherwise. Person 2 says, here is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study showing homeopathy doesn't work. Person 1 responds, okay, but that's just one study. That doesn't prove anything. Kind of a long one there, huh? So that's moving the goalpost because once we have satisfied one point, but then they tried to make it more difficult by moving the goalpost further out. All right, here's spot the fallacy. All androids love cats, so if you don't love cats, you're not a real android. That's a no true Scotsman. There may be androids who love cats, but there are also maybe androids who hate cats. Spot the fallacy. That can't be true because you're an idiot. That's a simple ad hominem because it's a personal attack and not focused on the argument itself. Spot the fallacy. America, love it or leave it. That's a black and white fallacy, or you can call it a false dichotomy or false dilemma, because it only gives us two options. Spot this fallacy. Everyone who completed my program improved their muscle mass. I'm the only one who completed the program. That's a cherry picking, because it ignores all the other people who dropped out of the program. Spot the fallacy. You used an ad hominem attack. I win this argument. That's a fallacy. You can't win an argument just by picking out fallacies in your opponent's argument. Okay, that's all I've got for you today. You have a couple opportunities to practice identifying fallacies in the coursework next week. Please feel free to refer to fallacies in your evaluation essays this week as well.